Welcome to Spiritual Psychology. My name is Renee McKenna. I'm a therapist, coach, soul mentor, and shamanic healer. And I'm here with Casey Stevens. We've connected on Instagram. And Casey is classically trained, mystically guided, practicing integrative psychotherapy, consciousness coaching, and quantum healing. And we had a nice connection the other day, and we decided to have a talk that would be beneficial to other people about organizing energy.
Yes.
Something we both do. So why don't you talk a little bit about organizing energy, Casey, and we'll jump in.
Okay. So I think I'm curious to hear what you think, but I think that just to start, kind of a baseline understanding is that we all have unique energy systems. So we have this, however you name it or label it or quantify that in your mind, body, spirit, right? There is this unique blueprint that we all have. And so knowing that, and sometimes we're in alignment with those things and sometimes we're out of alignment, but it's really then identifying what is baseline for us. If all things, sorry, I'm getting a phone call. If all things are aligned. And so really just kind of scanning and knowing if I am living, and that has everything to do, I would say, with virtues and values, which again are that part of that unique blueprint that we all have. And so it's getting conscious, I would say, of our values and what feels like that baseline for us. And then if there are things that are dysregulated or disjointed or disconnected, right, in terms of our real life and our values, it's really a matter, and this is, again, the way that I conceptualize it really easily in terms of organizing that energy when I speak to others and also within myself, is really identifying where is there a disconnect in my reality and my ideal self, meaning that blueprint that exists. And so how then would we target any one of those values or items that might be disorganized to be more aligned?
So when you talk about values, that's an interesting word. It might mean different things. How would you define values?
Well, virtues and values, I think, they're the people, places, things, the consciousnesses that we really value, right? So I might value an inner peace or a solitude or an introspection more than, and you might value more of a connection or being busy and all of those things. So it's really all of the things that make up who we are, but who we truly are, right? There's our reality, which also would show up as values. So if we're out of alignment in those values, it's what we identify with, it's what we resonate with, right? And so we might be impulsively choosing values or spending our time, our energy, our day doing, scrolling on Instagram for 7 hours or playing video games or, eating things that we don't really align. And so those things are showing up, and it demonstrates that there's some value that we are impulsively choosing around that. But then I think there's this whole other column that's kind of our blueprint column of what it is that we truly desire our life to look and feel like. And in that way, we'll notice that when we're aligned with our values, right, all of these things, and we're conscious of them, then we're free from anxiety and fears and depression and all of those things. So people will typically show up when there's a malalignment in my office, and I would presume it would be yours in the same way, right? When there's a malalignment of values and they're not conscious of it. And then I think there are different categories and strategies for addressing certain values in that way, but that's another extension on that I'm happy to go into. How do you conceptualize it? Tell me.
Well, so that's interesting. This is not a perspective that I ever take with clients, and so it's really interesting and exciting to talk about it this way. The way that I would see it in listening to you and talking about values is that there's, for most of the people that I work with, probably 3 columns. And there's the place, of course, where they're misaligned, where they're in dis-ease or doing something they don't like. Why am I doing this thing I don't want to be doing? I keep doing it. I'm in this bad relationship or a job I hate, or I'm eating too much, or I drink too much, or I feel depressed. So there's misalignment, right? So that's the behaviors or feelings, attitudes, whatever that is, that are invaluable.
They're invaluable. Yeah, good one.
And then there's, I think for most people, there's the values that they've been given. that they get from their family or their culture or their religion, or we get off of Instagram, or we get from outside. We get these values put upon us, and some of them may resonate with who we really are, but a lot of them might not. But most people struggle between, you know, that first place of misalignment, and then these values that are coming from the over culture, wherever they come from, the shoulds, whatever the shoulds are. I should, blah blah blah.
Right.
And then there's this other place, which is, I think, where we both work, which is, I call it people's authentic self, and you're calling it the blueprint, which is the essential uniqueness of each person, which may not have anything to do with either of those. That's
agreed. Yeah. And I really love your distinction, right, of putting that third column in there, which, you know, I think in my brain, I automatically sort that out into like what is and what really should be. So I just think I shuffle them together, but I love you kind of separating them out, because for me, I don't necessarily look at what the source of it is, right? If it's the overculture, if it's the programs that we've inherited, it's really, I've simplified it in that way, but they both work, right? I really love the distinction of that, like the sourcing of it, essentially, right? And then what is real, what is true, what is authentic, which is another great word for the blueprint, right?
Well, the reason, at least a lot of the people that I work with, is that middle column, the should column, or the supposed to column. I find that a lot of people don't easily have access to that authentic blueprint, right? And even if they do, it might be really dissonant from the place where they believe they should be. And that there's often a conflict between their authentic self, what I would call like their idealized self, and then this dysfunctional self. So for me, I'm actually often working with people who have a struggle against their authentic self that doesn't align with who they think they should be, or it might even cause trouble in their life if they come out.
Right. Absolutely.
You know, however, there's the coming out might be, whether it's energetically or physically or spiritually or sexually or just relationally, to be who they really are. So that's a lot of what I'm working. I just find that middle place is where a lot of people struggle.
Totally agreed. Yeah. And I think we're saying the exact same thing. So what I would then say is, and the reason I'll give people these kind of two columns sometimes is a practical exercise that they can do to kind of just discover, you know, what's happening here, right? Is there some low-hanging fruit is what I would call it, right? Which would be, are there things showing up in my life that are obvious that I just wasn't conscious how much discontent they were causing me, and then we can just shift our life, right? And so that's easy. And then there's this other layer of things, exactly this middle column as you would reference it, but I guess haven't provided that much clarity for people or for myself, but it's this column that then people probably need some guidance and support and some healing. Like, yes, they need help becoming conscious, but then again, if they truly desire to change, then they can shift some of those things. And it's the easy stuff to do. This deeper stuff typically requires some shamanic journeying or some therapy or some, quantum healer, or something that is going to help them shift, because it will feel so uncomfortable to do the thing that truly is in their highest and best interest, right? And so they're going to need some support in whatever limiting beliefs or internal blocks or whatever that is, compensatory strategies that are preventing them from moving those things easily, right? So now that they're aware of them, but it's like, I still can't move this because it would be too painful, or I don't know how, or there's some wounding that needs to be processed, or whatever that might be. So
there's a worksheet that I actually just developed it. I've been going to do it for years.
Oh, you're so good at that stuff.
And it's a process that I've used for years and years that I call the time integrity sheet. And I think it's really talking about, it's a way to talk about what you're talking about, which is, I have people list all the areas of their life and how they spend their time.
Right.
And so how do you actually spend your time? I spend 8 hours a day working. I spend 3 hours a day on TV. I do blah, 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 blah. And then sometimes I'll do it in this other order and ask this other optimal question first, which is, if you had all the time and the resources in the world, your optimal life, how would you spend your time?
Right.
And a lot of them, it's completely different. And to align and to look at those, that's why I call it the time integrity sheet.
I love that.
For
Good
me,
name.
being in integrity is when my thinking and my feelings and my actions are all in alignment. And
Which is organized energy. I would say that that is coherence inside your system, right? And we're all going to have a unique coherent system based on what our values are. And so I love that I love that you tie in integrity, right? Because it's coherence, right, between all of those systems and really listening to that. So it sounds like you got a great process for that for people. That's amazing.
well, and the thing that's important is that it changes over time,
Correct. Correct.
right? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, there can be this acute period of time where something is really important, and then that value can shift, and so I mean, incidentally, right, that can even happen. But I use it as an experiment that I think that hopefully we're always ever evolving, right? And so our values are going to change, but are we remaining conscious of them as we do? Which is why it's a great exercise that you ask people, if you had, no barriers, no limitations, that can help people access that authentic ideal self version of themselves, right? Because then they can start to think about whatever those limitations are. So it's a great kind of gateway to cut through all that, but also really practical, right? Like people have access to that anytime, right? They can do it on their own.
So what are some practical ways to organize our energy?
Well, there are some, just general things that might work, but not everything will work for everybody, because it really is going to depend on your system and what comes up for you, right? So again, there's these categories that I think of as like the low hanging fruit. It's like, now I'm conscious of it, so I can just move towards it more intentionally, right? And then it might be, what do I need to do if this is really causing a lot of disruption in my life, that these values being out of alignment? It might be that I conceptualize myself and I really want to be a yogi, but I haven't gone to yoga in 3 months, right? And so it's really getting clear and knowing, well, where do I need to apply? Because essentially, if we were taking all 2 of those columns or all 3 of them and lining them up, that's the coherence that we're talking about, right? The ideal self should be pretty parallel to the reality and what's actually happening. If we were just to say, hey, we're going to follow you around all day and dictate, take notes on how you're spending your time, energy, money, etc., right? That would tell us what's their reality is, and we want those lines, those columns to line up ideally. And if they're not, then it could be that there's something that's a really high value, I've found, that is disjointed, right? So something that's really important, it could be anything, right? Like you're a teacher and you're a guide. And so if you weren't doing any of that and your ideal self was screaming to do more of that teaching, right? Of course, I know you're prolific at that, but as an example, right? If that's not showing up, or it's showing up that you're getting very, very minimal amount of time teaching in your real life, well, then again, we can just shift and change those. So it's knowing where to apply it, but is it causing a lot of distress because this is a core piece of who you are? And how then do we move to shift it? And it might be identifying something else, like, oh my gosh, I'm really conflicted, because it could be, like you mentioned, somebody's sexuality, or something that is really in contrast with the programs that they've inherited or the way that they've seen themselves, right? Their persona, or what they've identified with. And so then that might really say, we might look at that together and say, well, what can we understand, and what journey can we go on to heal or have a deeper understanding? And that can be lots of tools that we can pull from our toolbox to help people through those things. But it's really identifying, right? Like, I always think there's an order too, because if there are competing needs, there truly is an order of priority. And again, that can change in time and place, but at any given time, there is always a prioritization that should be happening, right? That we should be conscious of. I just call that like the capital C consciousness. So, because if there are competing needs, right, it's like, well, I want to be connected to my family, but my family, and I'm gay, right, then my family doesn't accept that. Well, then these two needs might be really competing. So either if we haven't healed it and really gone in and done the inner work, that might be a lot of deeper processing, then usually what I think we do is our unconscious self, our unhealed, our wounded self will choose that thing that is actually not our higher value, and it will usurp the truly higher value, right? The true self. And so it's really identifying, is that happening anywhere where we're actually twisting our values, right? We're putting something that's of a lesser value ahead of something that's a higher value, but they seem really close, right? Is that how you conceptualize it, or how do you do it?
Well, I mean, I can just look at my own life experience. It's a really interesting thing, having, I like the idea that there's a order of operations. And I mean, I do believe that our work here as a human in this incarnation, however you hold that, is to become and to be our most authentic self in the world. But that can be a lifetime process. I mean, I didn't discover my work in the world until I was in my mid to late 30s. A very long time. And I rejected very vehemently anything that had to do with the kind of work that is actually my life work now. I grew up very conservative family. I mean, like Tea Party conservative, gun-toting Tea Party conservatives in New England. We didn't do quantum what and like shamanic what, like like we don't do any of that spiritual what, like none of that stuff, right? It was all very practical, very logical. And I was born as a very intuitive, sensitive empath. And I had to shut that baby down at about 5 years old, because there was no place for any of that in the dysfunction that I grew up in, right? So I became an alcoholic and a drug addict and a street criminal. And so I just became shadow identified, because my light was just like, there was no place for it. There was no support for it. There were no structures to hold it. And it took a really long time for me. And I tend to see people structurally. So almost like houses, right? Or like plants grow. Like in order to be a fruit, a tree has to get a strong trunk, and the branches have to be strong enough. Because I have seen them. They have there's little trees, and they'll like poke a peach out, and the whole tree will be like, because the peach is too heavy for it, right? So we need to build, like I had to build all kinds. I'm still building structures and within myself to be able to hold as I grow. It's like lifting weights, like you got to build the muscles, not just the muscles, but your joints have to be strong enough, your heart has to be able, there's all these systems to be able to support, and they're incremental. And so I think about this woman that I was working with who was trying to get sober from Adderall. And Adderall, so they did Adderall at college, and then she did Adderall at work. Everybody was doing Adderall, because everybody becomes really productive when you do Adderall, right? And so they're all doing it. She's a complete Adderall addict. Her house, she's a mess, but it looks okay at work, kind of. And then but she's depressed, and she's overeating, and she's abusing drugs all the time. And so she decides to get clean. But she really, underneath it, without the Adderall, she was terrified and had some learning disabilities, and work was really hard for her. But it was this is, again, for me, the 3 columns, like who she thought she should be is she wanted to impress people with this job title. She wanted to have a fancy car and a nice apartment and blah, blah, blah. But she couldn't, if we think about the priorities, she needed to get clean and sober and deal with a lot of trauma from her childhood and a lot of unresolved emotional issues that were driving these other things. And to even get to who her authentic self was really a challenge, because she was so attached to this idea of how things looked on the outside. She had to lose weight, she had to be pretty, she had to have the fancy job, the car, the blah blah blah.
Right.
Couldn't actually do either. She couldn't stay sober, and she couldn't be with her authentic self. Does that make sense? So
Of course.
that's like a very classic thing that I see with people, and they just keep falling back into the self-medication and into the pit.
Right.
Because what's really important was to support and nourish her authentic self and stop harming herself. And this middle thing had to kind of go away, but she was unwilling to let it go.
Yeah, I love this example, because I would say that's like, again, if somebody were to follow her around and really like this thing that might seem like a simple, like she takes an Adderall in the morning or maybe another one in the afternoon or whatever it is
Five.
or 5 or whatever. But, you know, that thing that might seem like a simple, you know, act, or it might take moments to actually do, is actually running her life. She's given it priority in her reality. Now it's not truly that, right? Because what it's substituting, or it's giving her the illusion, right, of actually being a higher. And so you can see then how much this thing, right, actually plays into all the other things that she thinks are going to get her to perhaps, you know, her true, authentic, ideal self. Some of the things, and maybe some of the things actually don't matter that much, because again, there is this third column you're talking about, if we're breaking it up that way, right? So it's really, you know, to your point, yeah. So what is the first order of business if we were to assess her and identify that Adderall is actually dominating her entire life and impacting every single one of these other values in terms of her ideal self? Well, then, yeah, you need to target that first. And I'm glad that you brought up the piece of addiction, because sometimes that has to be like a really gradual process, right? We can't, if something else is dominating, if it's an affair, if it's something that's external from you, that's having power over you, then that might be the very first order of business to tackle in order to even start doing the deeper work, right? It's like, well, because any addiction is just a compensatory strategy. It's not really what it is. I mean, yes, becomes deeper if there's a dependency on something outside of us, but there are so many addictions too. So it's really, how do we peel ourselves away from that and sit in this raw, you know, bareness of like, well, how do I even start to heal or identify who I am or feel those things, right? And that's going to be really like, I don't know, it just like, it's going to be so sensitive to go through that process. And yet it's necessary to then identify and do whatever healing would be necessary, or, you know, even contemplate, well, how much do I really value these things, right? These looks, or, you know, where did I even get that from, right? Is that even really what I believe and identify with? Or is it something that I've absorbed, right, from, again, external sources, programs, you know, all of it. So.
Well, it's interesting. I was just listening to Father Richard Rohr talk to Brene Brown. And I was unfamiliar with him. I was listening to him the other day, and he was talking a lot about ego deflation. And, you know, as we think about, again, there's another system that I use. I'm going to pull up one of my favorite pieces of art right now. This comes out of, this is a model of the unrealized self from a work called The Path Work.
Beautiful.
And this is like that idealized self, or our personality self, or our ego self, our mask. They call it the mask self, right? That's that kind of middle part I'm talking about, which that how we think we should be, right?
Right.
And then this darker part, it's very reflective here. This darker part is what they call the lower self. And that's all these like compensatory or distracting or their lower and resonance stuff that's harmful to us, generally makes us feel bad.
Yeah, the trauma responses, right? How we respond to trauma. Yeah.
Right. And then this in the middle is what they call the higher self. And that's the part that you're talking about aiming. I mean, you're really kind of just dealing with these two. You skipped this one maybe. And
well, it's woven in there in my
it's woven in there. And the idea, you know, for me in my own experience has been that mask self, the personality self, the should self, that's the part that really needed to go away.
Mm-hmm.
and that dealing with, probably we could call it the light and the darkness, that are really woven together. The darkness, just like the yin yang symbol, that beautiful thing with the darkness holds light in it, and the light always holds a little bit of darkness in it. And it's really, for me, about being able to wisen and integrate them.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of times for me, the things, because I have a weird configuration anyway, but a lot of times the things I've been most resistant to and even judged are the things that were actually part of my authentic self that I was rejecting. It's a very
Right. Yeah. Well, and I always, say, like, if it feels like you want to like vomit in your mouth about it, then, there's a really good clue, right? Yeah, I mean, talking about it or approaching just one of these values, the more resistance that we feel, oftentimes that's really actually giving you clues, right? If it's causing that real resistance that's coming up, however that is. I'm being silly about the vomiting in your mouth, right? But there is probably
Oh,
something.
no, don't be silly about that. I'm telling you. A lot of people doing that. So a lot of people are really doing that too. I was bulimic for a long
Absolutely.
time.
Yeah,
No
absolutely.
joke, right? Anyway.
Mhm.
I think it's interesting because I had a client yesterday who did a lot of self-harm, and
Mhm.
we were talking about her father's attempted suicide.
Mm.
And we went into, it was really powerful because we went into that part of herself that was traumatized by that experience. And what
Mm.
came up for her was that she was, even before he cut himself, he didn't die, but
Mm.
she had been cutting herself. And there was this unconscious mimicry. And,
Mhm.
and what I really got, and we talked about, it was really profound for her to see that this self-harm that she was doing was actually a ritual to try to process all this unprocessed stuff that was happening in her family.
Mm.
It was a ritual of extraction, of of
Mhm.
of trying to release the suffering, that she
Mm.
was attempting an alchemy in
Yep.
this, in a really rudimentary way. And
Right. Yep.
well, and certainly people do that very consciously with BDSM, and there's a lot of ways that people can do it ritually, and that is, it's a practice. But it's interesting the different ways that we can try to process stuff, and then to get conscious about what we're trying to process, and um and how to process it in a healthy way, or
Right.
how to not, anyway, we can get into all kinds of complications talking about organizing energy, because one of the things that comes up, and it certainly was true for me and it was true for my client, was that I was also managing a lot of things that weren't mine.
Mhm.
I was taking on other people's stuff. I was trying to manage pain that it didn't even belong to me and felt like it was my responsibility. And so some of the values and organizing energy for me has been like, what's mine and what's yours,
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
And for any healer, right, who truly is in that, right, not getting in the drama triangle, right, as the hero or the rescuer, it's like, do we unconsciously, and of course, what are the patterns that have led to that, the trauma responses that have led us to be, wired in that way. But it really, that's another part of organizing energy, right? Because your essence is a healer, right? You were born that way. It's part of your blueprint or your authentic self. But when not in balance, right, that's exactly what it can look like. We'll absorb and try to process other people's stuff, which is why it's great that we're talking about this, because it really is, or providing these tools for clients directly, or whatever that looks like, is because I really want them to be able to do that so that I don't have to take that on. I can't, I mean, we're all going to have our capacity, right, of what we can metabolize for ourselves and others. And we want other people to, be able to operate in that way where they can identify. But I love even, this example, right, of you doing this work with the self-harm with your client, because it really is like, when we go in, we can see what might be just some textbook in psychology. We would, put it all in some category or label it in some way. But what's so cool about this, adding the spiritual component, is that we can really look specifically, what is this self-harm for her? And there's going to be a totally unique story and picture that's going to show up, that then, there's exactly that. It's like, well, conscious awareness is really the key then, because to your point, that's exactly what it is. It's like, is she most efficiently processing this, or is she going in some circuitous path to try to have relief from this thing that she wasn't conscious of, and so she's not doing it in the right way, or in the highest and best way for her soul's kind of purpose, right? So bringing that awareness, right, around that specific story around her dad and his story, and this ritualistic kind of relief that she was seeking, it's really beautiful that again, you can bring her that awareness. And then it's like, well, the question then is, well, how would I truly, right, in a way that I desire to align with my authentic self, how could I ritualize that without performing this, self-harm, or putting myself in jeopardy, or whatever that is? Because oftentimes if we're not conscious and we're not choosing the most direct path, right? What's the most direct path consciously to heal ourselves? And so that would be an example in my kind of system of things that she needed your assistance to do, because she was caught in a loop of not knowing how to resolve that perhaps herself. I don't know that for sure, but it sounds like there was a loop that she was in, and this is the way I resolve this. This is the way I give myself relief, but it's not sustainable, right? It's that impulse relief rather than the sustainable, true desire. So,
Well, it's also built, I mean, we talk about spirituality and also, I suppose, wisdom principles, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of us learn unwisdom principles.
Right. Unwise principles. We learn unwise principles.
Right. So even again, we have this middle place of how things should be, which is often really dysfunctional or really low resonance. So,
Absolutely.
we can take my client's example, although I identify with it too. And I think a lot of people do, that the idea that I'm actually supposed to help other people manage their suffering. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's very interesting because I think we're both very mature healers, but I actually have a mentorship program. So I work a lot with other people, teaching them how to not help people right. in that way, right? Like that they're helping. And I was taught, I really believed that my work, like loving people, was suffering for them. That was love. That was what I understood that was. And that's the system of belief in this family. And we haven't even gone deeply into it, but there's like an agreement between and an understanding that we help each other by taking each other's suffering on, because I'm able to manage it. So here, manage it for me.
Right.
And I think
emotional enmeshment, right?
Yeah. So codependency, or whatever you want to, relationship addiction, right? All those different things that I think is a baseline. It was a revelation for me. And I was able to share this with this client yesterday. And when we hear the truth, a lot of times we know it. Yeah. Right? Which is on the ultimate level, everybody's responsible for their own life energy.
Right.
Like that's profound. That was profound for me. And it's profound as a healer and a therapist that I am not responsible for my client's life energy at all. Like that. Whoa. It's actually why I decided not to get licensed, to tell you the truth. Because actually in licensure, they want you to be a little bit responsible for the person's life energy. And I don't want that responsibility.
I love that. And, I know we talked about that, but I've debated about that myself and have to weigh, right? Like, because my true self would really agree with that, right? But
we all have places to grow, Casey, right? All the time.
Well, yeah, maybe there is that. But I know I talked about that, right? I feel like it gives me access. It gives people access to me that might otherwise not. So so that's why I do it. But I do things my own way anyway. I really operate as just in according to all of these things. But I really love those examples. And it is like the way that you're talking, circling it back to organizing energy, even when you're talking about the truth. It's like when we hear the truth, even if somebody's mirroring that back to us, we feel it in our bones, right? And that's going to be unique truth for everyone in different circumstances. But the truth is that is the resonance. That's the organization of energy inside of you. And so even to have a mirror or a reflection of somebody who can, I know I would certainly encourage anyone, just like how does this land? If I say anything to you, how does it really organize itself inside of you? How does it land? It's not because I see it, it's not, my truth, right? What's your truth? And in that way, right, it makes them accountable, right, for themselves, really learning that skill of how to recognize that organization, that resonance inside themselves.
Well, for me, that's where the spiritual pieces, I don't even know if it's spiritual piece, because for me, it's very spiritual foundation. I mean, I'll share with clients what I see, but I always tell them, you're the expert on you. I have you got to know, I have a whole bunch of filters. I even try to share with them what those are. Like, I certainly don't know. I barely know what's best for myself. Never mind knowing what's best for anyone else. And that's why I like working spiritually, particularly with shamanic tools, where people have their own resources, guides, teachers, religious figures, wise beings, their own wise self, spirit of nature, God, whatever they're working with, that's higher consciousness. And it is important actually that it's higher consciousness, because actually lots of people are working with stuff that's not necessarily higher consciousness, but anyway, that's a whole other conversation.
That's a whole other conversation.
But higher consciousness. And then those questions can be brought to that wisdom place dynamically, and people can receive the answers that feel true for them. Right? Of what is. So for example, this morning I had somebody who, it's funny, she just moved and she had a tapestry of Isis that she put behind. We were working on video, and I said, oh, what's that new? She said, oh, I just got this new tapestry. I really love it. It's Isis. I've always been interested in her. And I said, well, and she's an advanced practitioner at this point. And I said, well, have you ever thought about doing a journey to Isis? It's like, oh no, I haven't. So we've been working more on just a personal level with her stuff, and now she's moving into being a teacher. She's in a leadership role in her profession, and ready to kind of move into this more global place, which is where it's different for everybody, but sometimes you will level up from more personal guides and teachers into this more a larger transpersonal archetypal level. And so we did this journey to Isis and got to ask some really potent questions. And Isis can give her the answers.
Right.
And
right.
And it's like, because I don't know what those answers are. I don't even necessarily know what the questions are. And that's a lot of my work, is really to ground people, to connect with that higher wisdom that's available to all people. And it sounds like, we're using different language, but I think that's when you're talking about these two sides, that's really the work, right?
Yeah, well, and I would just I'm sure you use this language too, but that is that we create, our job is, right, the creation of this sacred circle or this container that facilitates the energetically and in all layers of the being, right? Really facilitates people doing their own healing and understanding themselves more truly and more clearly, and then knowing how to organize their energy so that they then are they are that energy as they move through their life, right? But it really is like, you're just the facilitator, the guide, right, that creates this container, this sacred circle, where that can now take place.
The metaphor that I like to use, actually almost any natural metaphor, whether it's growing things or healing things, works in this container. So like, I can plant, I can prepare the soil, and my client can plant the seeds, but the fact that the seeds grow is part of our participation in this larger system, right? Or if I cut myself, I might need stitches. And so, we might need a special circumstance, but the stitches don't actually make the skin regrow. Like that natural process of our own unfolding and the life force that's always self-organizing, that's always looking for healing and balance and evolution. We need to often have help and circumstances to optimize those situations. If you plant a seed in the dark and don't give it any water, it's not going to grow. It needs to go in the right place. Stitches next to the cut, it's not going to help, right? So there is circumstances that need to be provided, and we are interdependent, and often I know I need lots of help and lots of people do, but the actual flow of truth or wisdom or life force, that's the larger system that we're part of, that we are part of though.
We are part of it. We are it. We are part of it, right? That is kind of it's so essential that that this spiritual energetic layer really is incorporated into because you're right. We are always, our body, the different, whatever layer of being our injury or imbalance is on. It's seeking organically to self-organize and come to balance, right? But sometimes it gets, these screwed up ideas about how to do that, and it's the less direct path, right? And so we're not actually arriving at what our true desire is or what true healing would be, because we're creating something that now that needs to be healed in order to do this. And so it really is, it's like, how do you provide the essential nutrients that would be required in order to facilitate that healing, and then it will heal itself if it's ready to, and if it's clicking in and recognizing that, then it's beautiful, right? It's really beautiful, and that takes a lot of pressure off, right? It's like, doesn't require any energy, it fuels us.
All right, I'm going to get really heavy here for a minute, just because what's up. So I love that you said, like, I forget how you said it, like, we get off track.
Yeah.
And I think the good news for me, as I have come to expand my view of life into a much more meta perspective, even across lifetimes, even across multiple lifetimes, in an evolutionary path. I've been listening to the Book of Ra. I don't know if you're familiar with this. Very interesting information. Talks about different densities, like across whole evolutionary paths outside of like the human realm. This is the third density. There's a fourth density. There's other densities. Anyway, and they talk about different, we can kind of get off the path, but you know what? Ultimately, it's all going in this evolutionary direction back to unification. And, I have a good friend of mine who lives in the same apartment building as his brother, and his brother has been a crack addict for a really long time. And what happens when you do a lot of crack and you don't sleep for days and days is that you get psychotic. And so he's been a psychotic crackhead for literally for years. Like, it's terrible. He's really been suffering, and so he's a nice person, but he's just been a wreck. And my friend found him dead in his apartment this week.
Oh, Renee, I'm so sorry.
Probably, I think he's in his late 40s. He was in his, and he was dead for 3 days before they found him. They had to have the police go in. So, I have to say, I did a little bit of spiritual work. I don't usually do this, but because he's close, and it just felt like I actually felt him in the room when we were talking about him. And so when the dead person shows up, I pay attention to them. They don't always show up when I talk about them. Anyway, so I did a journey for him after. And the guides did some gathering. He was kind of shattered, and they did some gathering up of his self. And I could feel, I don't know how this all works. This is just what I saw. And his higher self was there, but his whatever this human self at this density wasn't aware of it. But there was a little bit more organization that happened just from that light being there. But the light that came, he was afraid of it. Like, I could feel like that's his path in this lifetime. People have tried to help him for years, and he hasn't been able to receive it. And the thing that I felt, I don't know, I've had a lot of people commit suicide. I've had a lot of people die, right? So it goes, and it's different, just like it's a unique thing for each person. But the thing that I really felt for him in this particular circumstance was, thank God. Like, thank God. Like, he needed, death is a relief. It is the end of suffering for a lot of people. And I mean, I don't know what's going to happen next time, and he ain't done for sure. But he was way off track, and he wasn't getting back on. And I don't even, I mean, I'm sorry for the family, but I have to say, I again, thank God he's not suffering anymore. I don't usually say that to people, and I don't
Right.
think I would say it to the family, right? But that's what I really felt like. He
Right.
needed a reset, and he's eventually the suffering itself. And
Mm-hmm.
this happened for me.
Mm.
More than the suffering itself will drive us to be willing to do the things that we wouldn't. The suffering itself
Right.
is to drive him to the light.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so even if we get way off,
Mm-hmm.
in the larger context, it's all going in it. I really believe that.
Yeah, I agree. And I notice this with spirits, right? Or people who are at the end of life and whatever it is, addiction, I agree, actually, generally it's especially deep addiction in those ways, but is very similar if there's a death, right? There, an overdose, right? There is, it's really, really similar to suicide energetically.
Yeah.
And a profound resistance. And this could be for anybody, right? Who just has maybe got the end of the life or whatever it is. There's such a resistance, I think, when there is this disconnect, right? Whatever the healing is that's so necessary, the spiritual healing, which would be, again, some of this deeper shamanic, healing that would be required. But the resistance is so strong that there is such a fear of death. And you see that all the time in people that just, average people, right? There's such a tremendous fear of death. Whereas I love that you can speak to that and really have a deeper understanding of death, right? And this process that he'll go through, of course, is very tragic. And yes, condolences, of course, to his family and, the initial shock of that. But the bigger picture, the evolutionary picture really is that this is an opportunity to be reborn and to get on that path, right? Because there was so much resistance, right? It feels like in that soul that he wasn't going to master that, right? And in this life, right? And so it would just be so much greater suffering for him and for the people around him. So yeah, I agree with that, right? And you can see, and that's why it's the people who show up that would be, you know, ready to really invest in themselves because they're willing to cross into that threshold, even if it's uncomfortable, even if there is resistance, the resistance has diminished enough or the suffering has gotten to such a point that then they can really work whatever the topic is that they need to resolve. There's a willingness, right, to overcome that in this life, right, in this life. And yeah, I'm sorry that happened.
It's interesting. Well, nobody gets out of here alive, Casey, right?
Nobody does. Yeah.
We
None of
have a
us.
lot of denial of death going on in our culture, but none of us gets out of here alive. So
Totally. Yeah.
I think it's interesting as you're talking. It really is obvious to me frequently that fear of death is very related to the fear of life.
Yeah.
Right.
And the authentic self that you're talking
that's
about.
what I mean. Like to really live fully, deep,
right.
And can be scary. It's risky. It's the unknown. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't have control. There is no safety here. Sorry, people. I know it's a bummer.
No, there's not. And
there's
that's
really not.
Right. I mean, we can't be comfortable and growing, right? Like we have to be evolving in this, and there will be challenge to ourselves and to our identities, to our persona, to all of those factors, right? It's like a deep process and it doesn't end, right? It doesn't end for you and I, even though we've been doing this, for a long time, right?
I ain't run out of stuff yet.
Me either. So right. I mean, it's being willing to engage in that and really understand that is the purpose, and we can't quit on it, right? But I love this conversation because it's probably not talked about often enough, right? This fear. I mean, you put that perfectly. The fear of death, really, ours and our loved ones, right? So to not really have an organized relationship with that really points directly to the fear of life and that authentic self, and how is the gap in those, and that's going to give you a lot of information about yourself.
All right, I gotta tell you, this is like the most amazing. I have this opportunity.
Yeah,
this opportunity to work with two different family members.
Mm,
in 2 different generations in this
mm,
family.
I love.
And so there's the daughter and the aunt,
Mm-hmm.
and the father committed suicide. So
Mm,
so my client's father committed suicide, the brother of my client committed suicide
brother, sister, yeah.
years
Mm-hmm.
ago.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the clients is a mentorship. She's a mentee, and we've been working deeply. She's a practitioner herself. She's a brilliant practitioner, actually. And so I know I can share the story because we've actually already talked about this in a very public way. So um so we were talking about we were talking about working with the dead, and in this really active shamanic way. And there's a lot of different work that you can do or need to do. Some people died just fine, they don't need any help, and some people need a lot of help. And
Right.
after her father died, she was overcome with depression for years. And
Mm,
over time, in her own evolutionary process, she realized that the depression wasn't hers, it was her father's. Like, she had taken on this energy of her father.
as a way to keep him there close.
It
Yeah.
was, well, and he also didn't want to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And so she learned way before she started working with me
Mm-hmm.
about psychopomp, and about it, which is escorting of souls, and spirit attachment, and negative energetic energy extraction, and did work over a period of months and years, actually, to clear his energy.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it was this beautiful thing because it actually brought her into the work that she now does as a healer, doing her own healing work. And she had this profound experience of, the experience that I can take on other people's energy in this profound way.
Right.
And that the release of anyway, so there was this whole thing that happened for her. It was quite profound. And then, so recently I start working with the sister of this man who's been dead now for over 10 years, 15 years,
Okay.
maybe 20 years. Anyway, he's been dead for a long time.
Right.
And we go into this work for her and her addiction, her initial addiction. She smokes pot. She smokes way too much pot.
Mm,
And the first time she smoked pot was a moment of connection with her brother at the time when they were young. And he kind of like bullied her into doing it as a way to be connected.
mm-hmm.
And so simultaneous with this, we did some work, and she was able to connect with his higher self in present time. And he's like this totally illuminated being, and has had all of this profound transformation after death, which doesn't always happen to people who commit suicide, I'm going to tell you.
Right. Yeah. Right.
But it did. And he was like, and they were able to connect. What she realized was that moment, 40, 50 years ago, when they were teenagers, where they connected around the drugs, which was not an authentic self connection for either of them, but it was the best they could do.
Right.
And they were able to connect in present time and actually offer love, deep love, and compassion and connection with each other spiritually. I mean, he's a spirit at this point, right? But they were actually able to be vulnerable in a way that was unacceptable in their family, to be authentic self with each other.
Yeah, true intimacy, right?
It was this amazing. And she's actually probably going to stop smoking pot.
You know what? I'm sure she will, right? Because not knowing what that unconscious association was, it's like becoming conscious. And I really love that story too, because when we think about offering people the dignity of their own process, right? And so when we if we're unconsciously, even so, it's even more layers, right? If we're unconsciously doing it, but if we're unconsciously carrying around our father's depression, or unconsciously smoking pot because it's connected to some, connection we thought we were, building with our brother or whatever, that is no longer here, so we can still do that. When we're still holding on to those things, I'm sorry, the sun's setting, so it's like all these layers of.
Actually, the light looks really good on you, so you're good.
Oh, good. Okay, good. I'm like, it keeps getting brighter and dimmer and all the things, so bear with me. But it really is when we truly energetically give back those emotions or those associations, and we let if they're in real life, I mean, if they're still as a living soul, or if they've crossed on, if we can send those fragmented parts, pieces back to the owner of them, then it gives him the capacity, which I presume is what happened, to truly process. But if we're still holding on to a part for somebody, even though we think we're doing something good for them or for us, it disallows them, it disrupts their process, it delays their process of really having all their own energy back, which is why it's so essential, right, that we possess all our own energy, we reclaim all these fragments that have been disowned or whatever the purpose of that is, right? So I really love that processing, and you could facilitate that, because again, probably neither of them before their work with you were even conscious of what those associations were that was manifesting in their life in this way, right? It's brilliant.
Well, again, though, when we create the container, you know, I don't know where we're going.
Me either.
I don't know where we're going. But I do know how to be present.
Right.
And like and just keep asking, like, what wants to happen here? And again, this organizing principle that is natural when people are allowed the agency to be able to do it and have grounding and feel connected to be able to do that, not with me necessarily, but with the larger system, then all of these things happen. I mean, that's why I'm ever a student.
Right. And we are, because we learn every single, I mean, I'm exactly the same. I show up and I have no idea. Am I going to be talking to aliens today? Am I be working with dragons? Am I working with like, spirits? Like, bring it on. Right. And it's just being able to, meet all of that, because number one, it's just fascinating for us to greet that energy, but to help people organize, right? Because they're leveraging that coherence in us, or our ability to perceive that coherence and where that might be in their blind spots, right? So I love that story. That's brilliant, right? That they can come back to that.
You can't make this up. You can't make this up. I don't think so.
Well, and the layers that seem like it's the problem, you realize that's not really the problem. That's just typically the compensation for the problem, right? That can just sort itself out really easily, right? And they wouldn't have been able to do that maybe if they weren't conscious of all of that and shifting it. But smoking pot, it's like, well, I can shift that, or the depression that I had, it just lifts. It's just like, can be immediately gone from somebody's life. And it's so miraculous to witness. And every time I'm like always in awe of it. And yet, I can still be like, whoa, that was pretty amazing, right?
Oh, yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, it happened to me. November 4th, 1987. Boom. My entire life changed. I got sober.
What happened?
I got clean and sober. I had been using drugs and alcohol for years. I got sober and I've never gone back. That's it. My whole life has changed. One night I drank. That's it. No.
What shifted?
That's a whole long story. We'll tell that a story another time. But so I just love talking to you. I think it's fabulous. And I want to leave people with, or offer them, some practical application. We're all over the place with all of the possibilities, ways to talk about this, but how can we help people to organize their own energy and to clarify their own value? So I have my little tool of write down the way you actually spend your time and write down how you'd wish you spent your time. Maybe I'll put a link to that little worksheet in the show notes.
Oh, good idea. Yeah.
Worksheet. To look at where your values, I mean, that's how I look at, like, what do you actually value? And then what are you doing that's actually that's in somebody else's values, right? So that's my little offering. But what would you offer for some tips or tools?
I would say it's really similar. And so I think it's important to kind of think about, again, when we end up having competing needs, where we might think something, it's like, well, these are close. So if you write all that down again, and then you spend the time to actually organize it in order of priority, insofar as right? And then we're only going to be able to get so far, because then we might think, well, this thing is super important to me. But then at deeper glance, or once you've done some work, you recognize, oh, it's not, I mean, your client, for instance, who smoked the pot, she might think that was really, or the Adderall or whatever, right? Like, think that's really valuable to them, but actually, when two competing needs, like I'll have people almost imagine, you can imagine energetically when you're having a hard time organizing that system and prioritizing it in terms of like, again, no two things can be on the same line. And so what do you truly value? And so energetically, I think a really good exercise for that, everything you said in your worksheet is exactly really how I would have people do it, in terms of just being conscious of it. So now we know we're conscious of it. And then if it feels like things are competing, or I don't know quite where to put this thing, or at this moment, right? And all we ever have is this moment and what that is now. And so you can imagine, let's just say, I don't know, there's some value over here, and then over here, literally imagine holding them in your hands energetically and envision, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to drop this thing into this hand, I'm going to drop this Adderall into this hand, and I'm going to drop this feeling a sense of peace into this hand, and really feel energetically which one has more weight. You can do that. You can put things on note cards and then think, well, how am I going to lay these out in an ordered? So I think the order really matters, because again, if we're just slapping down a bunch of values, then it's like, well, when we have competing needs, are we acting from our conscious self or our wounded self, right? Are we acting from our heart, or are we doing what we think we ought to do, right? And usually, that thinking place is not necessarily our highest self. So really, I mean, there's different tools for doing that, but I think energetically, right, you can just sit as if you have a scale, right? And you are the scale, and feel into what is truly this higher version of myself. If we're using your worksheet of like, if there were no barriers in terms of, time, energy, money, whatever, what do I truly value the most, right? And then that might give people just the insight into themselves a little deeper, into that authentic self. But they might still get the wrong answer, right? And say, oh, no, I need this, because they're still scrambled, right? They're still too fragmented or too far away from knowing themselves truly. But it's all an experiment, and it's going to unfold, right? You're not going to do this exercise the first time. If you're doing it just, at home for free or whatever you can do without any guidance, it's not going to be perfect. And just know that, right? Like there are going to be things that we're going to look and recognize, oh, I really need some support in that, or I don't really have the right insight into that I think I should, or having somebody again reflect that back to you, like, well, what could this possibly be? And again, it becomes this like exploratory experience where we're helping them to discover, well, yeah, what is this association that we've made, right? And is it an impulse? And there's a huge difference between impulse and desires. So I think our desires really align us with that authentic self, and our impulses that sometimes seem like it can be confusing to us, because we really think the impulse is aligning me with my desire, but it's actually in opposition to your desire typically, right? And so if my impulse is, hey, I want to be somebody who's really healthy and fit, and I, feel confident and great in my clothes, or whatever that would be, right? And I have this impulse to eat ice cream every night, that's in direct competition to what might be a true desire to, like, well, this is how I feel confident in my body or whatever. So I think about really even looking, and that can be a clue sometimes if you're having a hard time with the scales. Is this an impulse that's telling me that this is important, or is it truly a desire?
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
So I hope that helps people just kind of start to organize, because again, if people come in and they've again eliminated the low hanging fruit, or they've gotten enough insight into themselves, and then we know, well, what pieces actually do we really need guidance and healing, which again, we've all, been through those cycles, and we really do need that, because we just don't have enough insight, or there's so many layers that are protecting this resistance to stay in place. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I love the scales. That's a nice.
Yeah. And you can literally just energetically feel like, okay, well, if I think these are competing, okay, I'm going to just spend some time and drop the consciousness of this thing into this hand. I'm going to drop the consciousness of this thing, and really feel them land in your hand, really know the difference, and then just see what they do. What do they tell you? Because, like there is this wise self that our body is, and it will tell you the truth all the time. It's trying to tell you the truth all the time. It's that truth that we just know when we feel it, once we start to become conscious. So,
well, the good news is, as someone who has often ignored that truth many, many times in my life, that it all comes out in the wash, and it will take us interesting places, but I don't really think there are wrong answers.
There are no wrong answers, right? And just knowing it's not about getting it right. I mean, it's not about getting it right. It's, are you actively in communion with the process to get into the place where you could have more consciousness and insight into yourself? Are you actively in communion? And that might be ticking one thing off at a time, or spending 3 months to tick this one thing, or whatever it is. It's like all just an experiment, but are you generally on the right course? Or are you stagnating, right? Are you stuck? And are you resisting, something? Why might that be?
And that's information too, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Casey, so great to talk.
Love talking.
Loved it.
Yeah.
We'll have to do it again.
We will have to do it again. Thank you so much for having me. I hope people will enjoy the conversation, and yeah, you'll have
I
to.
don't care if they did. I enjoyed it. So that's all.
Yeah, me too. True.
Awesome. So why don't you just verbally, we'll drop some stuff in the show notes, but why don't you just tell people how they can get in touch with you?
Oh yeah. So the name of my practice, I mean, you can look my name, Casey Stevens, or Shrink Bigger is the handle, and you can find me on most networks that way. And yeah, if in any way I can serve or assist in any of this, then happy to do so. Happy to connect.
Awesome. Casey, thanks so much, and for all the beautiful work you're doing in the world.
You as well, darling. I'm so grateful. And even this, disseminating the information is so important.
It's so good. It's so good. All right, dear. Let's do it again.
Let's do it again.
All right, Casey. Blessings.
Blessings. Bye.
Bye.